Hello, my sleepyheads. It's good to have you back. Tonight, we'll journey through the life of one of history's greatest conquerors, Alexander the Great. But before we begin, I just want to say thank you for being here. If these stories bring you peace or help you drift into rest, it would mean the world if you liked the video and subscribed. Your support truly helps me grow and keep making these calm journeys through time just for you. Now, let's begin. In the northern reaches of ancient Greece, where the mountains touched the sky and the forests whispered secrets of gods and heroes, there was born a child who would reshape the world. The year was 356 BCE, and in the palace of Pella, capital of Macedon, Queen Olympias gave birth to a son. They named him Alexander, and from his first breath, the world seemed to hold its breath in return. Macedon was not like the polished city-states of southern Greece. It was a land of warriors and kings, where the nobility rode horses across vast plains, and the common folk spoke with accents that made the Athenians wrinkle their noses in disdain. Yet it was here, in this frontier kingdom, that destiny chose to plant its most precious seed. Alexander's father was Philip II, a man whose ambition matched his brilliance. Philip had taken the throne of Macedon when it was weak and divided, threatened by barbarian tribes from the north and scorned by the Greeks from the south. Through cunning diplomacy and revolutionary military tactics, he had transformed his kingdom into the most powerful force in the Greek world. The phalanx, that wall of bronze-tipped spears 16 rows deep, had become his signature, and Macedonia's armies had never known defeat. But Philip was more than a conqueror. He was a dreamer who saw beyond the petty squabbles of Greek city-states to something grander. He envisioned a united Greece standing together against the great empire of Persia that stretched from the shores of the Aegean to the mountains of India. It was a dream that would pass like a sacred flame from father to son. In the palace gardens of Pella, young Alexander played among the olive trees and fountains, but his games were never ordinary. While other children played with wooden toys, Alexander studied the movements of ants and imagined them as armies. He would lie on his stomach in the grass, watching columns of insects march in formation, and in his mind's eye he saw the clash of civilizations. His mother, Olympias, was a woman of fierce intelligence and fiercer pride. She claimed descent from Achilles himself, the greatest hero of the Trojan War, and she filled her son's nights with stories of gods and heroes. In her arms, Alexander learned that the blood of legends flowed through his veins, that he was destined for greatness beyond the borders of any single kingdom. "Listen, my son," she would whisper, as the evening fires cast dancing shadows on the walls. "In your dreams, you will hear the footsteps of your ancestors. Achilles ran swift as the wind, and his rage shook the walls of Troy. Heracles lifted the world upon his shoulders. And you, my beautiful boy, you carry their strength in your heart." But it was not only dreams that shaped Alexander's mind. When he reached the age of 13, Philip summoned the greatest philosopher in Greece to serve as the boy's tutor. Aristotle, student of Plato and master of all knowledge, arrived in Macedon carrying scrolls and instruments, ready to educate a prince. In a quiet grove near the town of Myesa, Aristotle established his school. Here, surrounded by the gentle sounds of flowing water and rustling leaves, Alexander and his companions learned the secrets of the world. Aristotle taught them mathematics and medicine, astronomy and ethics. But most importantly, he taught them to think. Knowledge, Aristotle would say as they walked beneath the trees, is not the possession of facts, but the understanding of connections. The wise man sees how all things touch all other things, how the movement of the stars affects the tides, how the character of a king shapes the destiny of nations. Alexander absorbed these lessons like parched earth receives the rain. He learned to read the works of Homer as if they were battle plans, to study the campaigns of ancient heroes as if he might one day walk in their footsteps. The Iliad became his constant companion, a leather-bound volume that would travel with him to the ends of the earth. Under Aristotle's guidance, Alexander studied the great cities of the world: Athens, with its democracy and philosophers; Sparta, with its warrior culture and iron discipline; Thebes, proud and stubborn, defender of Greek liberty; and beyond Greece, the vast Persian Empire, rich beyond imagining, but grown soft with luxury and corruption. A kingdom, Aristotle taught, is like a body. It must have a strong heart to pump life to all its parts, clear eyes to see dangers approaching, and steady hands to grasp opportunity when it comes. But most importantly, it must have a soul, a purpose that gives meaning to all its actions. As Alexander grew from boy to youth, his father's campaigns continued. Philip's armies marched south, bringing one Greek city after another under Macedonian influence. The great battle came at Cheronea in 338 BCE, when the combined forces of Athens and Thebes faced Philip's phalanx on the field of honor. Alexander, now 18 and burning with the need to prove himself, commanded the companion cavalry, the elite horsemen who had become his father's most trusted weapon. The battle unfolded like a deadly dance. The Athenians and Thebans fought with the courage of free men defending their homeland, but they could not match the discipline and coordination of Philip's forces. At the crucial moment, when the enemy line began to waver, Alexander led his cavalry in a charge that broke the heart of Greek resistance. As the dust settled over the battlefield, Philip embraced his son, tears of pride streaming down his weathered face. "Today," he said, "you have proven yourself worthy of the name you bear. But remember, my boy, victory in battle is only the beginning. The true test of a king is what he builds after the fighting ends." The victory at Cheronea made Philip master of Greece, but it also kindled dreams of greater conquests. For decades, the Persian Empire had been the enemy of all Greeks, the source of invasions and interference. Now, with Greece united under his banner, Philip began to plan the greatest campaign in history, a march across the Hellespont to bring Greek civilization to the barbarous East. But fate, that capricious goddess, had other plans. In 336 BCE, at the wedding of his daughter Cleopatra, Philip was struck down, by an assassin's blade. In an instant, the great king was gone, and the future of his dreams hung in the balance. Alexander, now 20 years old, stood over his father's body as the palace erupted in chaos. Nobles whispered of civil war, enemies sharpened their swords, and the great alliance of Greek cities trembled on the edge of collapse. But in that moment of crisis, something awakened in Alexander that had been sleeping since his birth. He was no longer merely Philip's son, or Olympias's child, or Aristotle's student. He was Alexander, king of Macedon, heir to a dream that stretched from the familiar hills of his homeland to the unknown shores of distant seas. The blood of Achilles sang in his veins, the wisdom of Aristotle filled his mind, and the strength of his father's example guided his steps. As he knelt beside Philip's still form, Alexander made a silent vow. The dream would not die with the dreamer. The march to Asia would begin, not when it was convenient or safe, but when the world least expected it. He would prove that the boy from Macedon was ready to become the master of the world. Outside the palace, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the affairs of mortals. But if they had possessed the power of prophecy, they might have trembled at what was to come. For in that moment of grief and determination, the greatest conqueror in human history had just been born. The gentle winds that had once carried the laughter of a child at play now carried something else, something that would echo across continents and down through the centuries. It was the sound of destiny itself, taking its first tentative steps toward a rendezvous with immortality. In the years to come, men would speak of Alexander the Great, of his conquests and his glory, of the empire that stretched from Egypt to India. But perhaps the truest measure of his greatness was born in that moment when a grieving son looked down at his father's face and chose to carry on a dream that was larger than any single life. The boy from Macedon had become a king, and the king would become a legend. But first, he had to secure his throne and prove to a doubting world that Philip's son was worthy of Philip's crown. The real story of Alexander the Great was just beginning. The death of Philip sent shockwaves through the ancient world, like ripples across a still pond. In Athens, orators proclaimed that the tyrant was dead, and freedom was reborn. In Thebes, old warriors sharpened their spears and spoke of independence. In the mountains of Thrace and Illyria, barbarian chieftains tested their weapons and dreamed of Macedonian gold. Everywhere, it seemed, there were those who believed that with Philip gone, his kingdom would crumble like a sand castle before the tide. They had forgotten to account for Alexander. In the palace at Pella, as the funeral preparations began and the court whispered of uncertainty, the young king moved with the swift precision of a hunting cat. While others debated and hesitated, Alexander acted. Within hours of his father's death, he had secured the loyalty of the army, eliminated his rivals, and begun the delicate work of holding together an empire that threatened to tear itself apart. The first challenge came from within his own family. Amyntas, son of Philip's brother, had a claim to the throne that some considered stronger than Alexander's own. There were whispers in the corridors, promises made in shadowed corners, plans hatched by ambitious nobles who saw opportunity in chaos. But Alexander moved like lightning, striking before his enemies could fully form their plots. One by one, the potential rivals vanished. Not in the brutal manner of Eastern despots who left trails of blood and terror, but with the surgical precision of a master politician. Some were exiled to distant provinces. Others found themselves appointed to posts that took them far from the capital. A few, those whose loyalty could not be bought or whose ambition could not be contained, simply disappeared into the night, their fates known only to Alexander and the gods. "A king," Alexander remarked to his closest friend, Hephaestion, as they walked through the palace gardens where he had played as a child, "must be like a physician treating a diseased body. Sometimes the cure requires cutting away infected flesh, not from cruelty, but from love of the whole." Hephaestion, tall and golden-haired, with eyes that reflected the same burning intensity as his friends, nodded in understanding. They had grown up together, studied together under Aristotle, and now they would face the challenges of kingship together. Their friendship was deeper than brotherhood, more enduring than love, a bond that would sustain Alexander through all the triumphs and tragedies to come. With the immediate threats to his throne eliminated, Alexander turned his attention to the broader challenges facing his kingdom. The Greek cities, sensing weakness, had begun to assert their independence. In Thebes, the faction that favored freedom from Macedonian rule grew stronger each day. In Athens, Demosthenes, the great orator who had spent his career warning against Philip's ambitions, now proclaimed that the young king was nothing more than a boy playing at war. But Alexander had learned more from his father than merely how to fight battles. He had learned the art of statecraft, the delicate balance between force and diplomacy that kept empires together. Rather than immediately marching south with his armies, he chose a different approach. A delegation of Greek cities was summoned to Corinth, where Philip had established his headquarters for the planned campaign against Persia. One by one, the representatives arrived, many expecting to negotiate with an inexperienced youth who could be manipulated or intimidated. Instead, they found themselves facing a king who combined his father's political acumen with something entirely new, a charisma that seemed to bend the very air around him. "My friends," Alexander addressed the assembly, his voice carrying the authority of generations of kings, "my father dreamed of a united Greece, marching together against our ancient enemy. That dream did not die with him. It lives in every Greek heart that beats with pride in our shared heritage, in every soldier who carries our spears, in every citizen who looks eastward and sees opportunity where others see only danger." The delegates listened, and many found themselves swayed despite their intentions. There was something about this young king that defied easy categorization. He was not merely Philip's son, carrying on his father's policies. He was something new, a fusion of Greek culture and Macedonian power, of philosophical training and warrior instinct. Most of the cities agreed to renew their allegiance to the Macedonian crown. The Corinthian League, Philip's creation for organizing the Greek world, was reconstituted under Alexander's leadership. The campaign against Persia would proceed as planned, with Alexander as the supreme commander of all Greek forces. But not all problems could be solved with words and diplomacy. In the north, the barbarian tribes sensed opportunity in the change of leadership. The Thracians and Illyrians, never fully conquered by Philip, began to press against the borders of the kingdom. If Alexander was to lead the Greeks against Persia, he could not leave enemies in his rear. The campaign that followed revealed the young king's military genius for the first time. Moving with a speed that caught his enemies completely off guard, Alexander led his army north into the mountains of Thrace. The terrain was brutal, all steep slopes and narrow passes, perfect for ambush and guerrilla warfare. The Thracians, confident in their knowledge of the land, prepared to bleed the Macedonian army white in a war of attrition. Instead, Alexander outmaneuvered them at every turn. Using tactics that combined his father's innovations with his own intuitive understanding of warfare, he turned the barbarians' advantages against them. When they tried to block his advance in a narrow pass, he found alternative routes through terrain that others had declared impassable. When they gathered in strength for a decisive battle, he struck at their supplies and communications, forcing them to disperse. The climactic engagement came at Mount Haemus, where the Thracians had assembled a massive force behind a wall of war carts, each laden with stones and positioned to roll down the mountainside and crush any advancing army. It was a formidable defensive position, one that would have given even Philip pause. Alexander studied the obstacle for a long time, walking back and forth in front of his assembled troops. Then, with the same clear thinking that Aristotle had trained him to apply to philosophical problems, he devised a solution that was both elegant and devastating. "When the carts roll down," he announced to his men, "those who can shall step aside. Those who cannot shall lie down and lock their shields above their heads. The carts will roll over you harmlessly, and then we shall climb the mountain and show these barbarians what Greek discipline can accomplish." The battle unfolded exactly as Alexander had predicted. The Thracians released their carts in a thunderous avalanche of wood and stone, confident that no army could survive such an assault. But the Macedonian phalanx, trained to perfection and inspired by their young king's calm confidence, executed the maneuver flawlessly. Some units parted like water before the rolling obstacles. Others formed protective shells that let the carts pass over them without harm. Then, before the Thracians could reorganize, the Macedonians charged up the mountain with a precision and ferocity that broke their enemies' will. The battle was over before noon, and with it, the rebellion in Thrace. But even as Alexander was securing his northern borders, trouble was brewing in the south. The Thebans, encouraged by reports of the king's absence, had risen in open revolt. They had expelled the Macedonian garrison from their citadel and declared their independence from the Corinthian League. Other cities watched nervously, waiting to see how the young king would respond to this direct challenge to his authority. Alexander's response was swift and decisive. Marching south with a speed that seemed impossible, he appeared before the gates of Thebes with his entire army before the city's leaders had even finished their victory celebrations. The sight of the Macedonian phalanx drawn up in battle order, Their bronze spear points, glinting in the morning sun, sent a chill through the hearts of the rebels. Even then, Alexander offered mercy to those who would lay down their arms. He had no desire to destroy one of Greece's most ancient cities, no wish to spill the blood of fellow Greeks on the eve of the great campaign against Persia. But the Thebans, proud to the point of blindness, chose to fight rather than submit. The siege of Thebes lasted only a few days, but its conclusion was terrible in its finality. When the walls were breached and the Macedonian forces poured into the city, Alexander's control over events slipped for one of the few times in his career. The soldiers, angry at the losses they had suffered and inflamed by memories of Theban resistance to Macedonian rule, showed no mercy. When the killing finally stopped, 30,000 Thebans had been sold into slavery, and the city itself was razed to the ground. Only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared, monuments to divine and cultural achievement that even war could not justify destroying. The destruction of Thebes sent a message that echoed throughout the Greek world. Alexander might be young, but he was not weak. He might prefer diplomacy to force, but he would not hesitate to use overwhelming violence when his authority was challenged. The other Greek cities, watching from afar, decided that cooperation with the Macedonian king was preferable to sharing Thebes' fate. But the young king took no joy in the city's destruction. Standing in the smoking ruins of what had once been one of Greece's greatest cities, he was reminded of the terrible responsibility that came with absolute power. In later years, he would call the destruction of Thebes one of his greatest regrets, a moment when the demands of kingship had overruled the teachings of philosophy and compassion. "Power," he said to Hephaestion, as they prepared to leave the devastated city, "is like a sword that grows sharper with each use. But the sharper it becomes, the more dangerous it is to those who wield it." With Greece secure and his authority unquestioned, Alexander could finally turn his attention to the great dream that had consumed his father's final years. The campaign against Persia, that vast empire that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, was ready to begin. In the spring of 334 BCE, the Macedonian army assembled at Amphipolis, ready to cross the Hellespont and enter Asia. 35,000 men had answered the call, the finest soldiers in the world, trained to perfection and equipped with the most advanced weapons and tactics known to military science. But more than soldiers, they were crusaders, carrying the banner of Greek civilization into the barbarous East. As Alexander stood on the deck of the ship that would carry him across the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, he must have thought of all the events that had brought him to this moment. The lessons of Aristotle, the example of his father, the blood of Achilles that flowed in his veins, all had prepared him for this destiny. Behind him lay the familiar world of Greece, with its mountains and olive groves, its philosophers and poets, its memories of glory, and its dreams of greater glory to come. Ahead lay the unknown, a vast continent filled with strange peoples and stranger customs, with riches beyond imagining and dangers beyond calculation. But Alexander felt no fear as he gazed across the water toward the Asian shore. He had proven himself a master of war and statecraft, a king worthy of his father's crown and his mother's dreams. The boy from Macedon had become the leader of Greece, and now he was ready to become something more. The greatest adventure in human history was about to begin, and at its head rode a young king who believed that the world itself was barely large enough to contain his ambitions. The conquests that would follow would reshape the map of civilization and echo through the centuries, but they would also test the character of their leader in ways that no amount of preparation could anticipate. As the ships began to move across the Hellespont, Alexander must have felt the weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders, like a mantle woven from the dreams of gods and heroes. The time for preparation was over. The time for legend had begun. The Hellespont stretched before the Macedonian fleet like a ribbon of silver in the morning light, separating the familiar world of Europe from the vast unknown of Asia. As his ship cut through the gentle waves, Alexander stood at the prow, his purple cloak streaming behind him in the wind, his eyes fixed on the distant shore, where destiny waited. The young king had not come to this moment unprepared. For months he had studied every detail of Persian strength and weakness, poring over maps and intelligence reports, questioning merchants and exiles who had seen the enemy's armies with their own eyes. He knew that beyond the narrow strait lay the greatest empire the world had ever known. Ruled by Darius III, a king who commanded the loyalty of dozens of nations and could field armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. But knowledge and preparation could only carry a man so far. As the Asian coastline grew clearer, Alexander must have felt the mixture of excitement and trepidation that comes to all great adventurers standing on the threshold of the unknown. He was 22 years old, barely past boyhood by some measures, yet he carried with him the hopes and dreams of the entire Greek world. The landing at Abydos was unopposed, the Persian satraps having decided to meet the invaders inland rather than contest the beaches. As Alexander's sandaled feet touched Asian soil for the first time, he performed a ritual that would be remembered for millennia. Drawing his spear from his belt, he hurled it as far as his strength could carry it, then walked forward to retrieve it from where it had fallen. "I claim this land," he announced to his assembled officers, "as a gift from the gods and a prize won by Macedonian spears." But before marching inland to meet the Persian armies, Alexander had a pilgrimage to make. Following the coast southward, the Macedonian force came to the ancient city of Troy, where legend claimed the greatest war in history had been fought 1,000 years before. Here, where Achilles had dragged Hector's body around the walls and where Priam had begged for his son's corpse, Alexander paused to honor his ancestors and seek their blessing for the campaign ahead. In the ruins of the Temple of Athena, Alexander made sacrifice to the goddess of wisdom and warfare. Then, in a gesture that revealed the depth of his connection to the heroic past, he ran naked around the tomb of Achilles, as was the custom for athletes honoring the dead. Hephaestion ran beside him, honoring Patroclus, Achilles' beloved companion, in the same manner. "Here," Alexander said as they stood before the hero's grave, lies the greatest warrior who ever lived. They say his mother dipped him in the river Styx to make him invulnerable, but she held him by the heel, and that remained mortal. Perhaps the gods knew that even the greatest of heroes must have some weakness, some reminder that they are not divine. From the priests of the temple, Alexander received a shield that was said to have belonged to Achilles himself. Whether the claim was true mattered less than the symbolism. As he strapped the ancient bronze to his arm, the young king was linking himself to a tradition of heroism that stretched back to the dawn of Greek civilization. The Persian response to the Macedonian invasion was swift but predictable. Arsites, satrap of Hellespontine, Phrygia, had gathered an army of Persian nobles and Greek mercenaries at the Granicus River, a swift-flowing stream that marked the natural boundary of his province. It was a strong defensive position, with steep banks that would make any crossing treacherous, and the Persians had positioned themselves on the eastern bank, with their cavalry in front and their infantry behind. When the Macedonian army reached the Granicus, Alexander's senior officers urged caution. The river was swollen with spring rains, the current was treacherous, and any attempt to cross would leave the army vulnerable, while half the force was still splashing through the water. "Wait," advised Parmenion, Philip's old general and the most experienced officer in the army. "Let them come to us, or find another crossing. This is no place to risk everything on a single throw of the dice." But Alexander had not come to Asia to play it safe. Standing on the western bank of the Granicus, looking across at the glittering ranks of Persian cavalry, he saw not danger, but opportunity. The enemy had chosen their ground well, but they had also committed themselves to a purely defensive strategy. They would wait for his attack, confident in their position, never imagining that he would be bold enough to assault them head-on. "Today," Alexander announced to his army, "we write the first page of a new chapter in history. On the other side of this river stands the flower of Persian nobility, men who have grown soft in their luxury and forgotten what it means to face soldiers who fight for their freedom. Show them what Greeks can do when their cause is just and their courage is strong." The battle began with Alexander himself leading the charge across the river. Mounted on Bucephalus, the great black stallion that had been his companion since boyhood, the king plunged into the swirling water at the head of his companion cavalry. Behind him came the finest horsemen in the world, men who had trained together since childhood and would follow their king into the gates of hell itself. The crossing was chaos. Horses stumbled on the rocky riverbed. Riders fought to keep their seats as the current tried to sweep them downstream, and all the while Persian arrows whistled overhead and Persian cavalry charged down the bank to meet them. But Alexander's presence was like a beacon in the confusion, his voice rising above the din of battle, his spear flashing as he struck down enemy after enemy. The moment when the king reached the eastern bank was the turning point of the battle. A Persian noble named Mithridates, son of the satrap Arsites, spurred his horse forward to win immortal glory by striking down the Macedonian king. Their spears met with a crack that echoed across the battlefield, and Mithridates' weapon shattered against Alexander's shield, the shield of Achilles, that had been blessed by the gods themselves. Before the Persian could draw his sword, Alexander's spear took him in the chest, and he toppled from his horse to lie still in the mud. But even as one enemy fell, another took his place. Rusacus, brother of the satrap, swung his curved sword at Alexander's head with such force that it split the king's helmet and drew blood from his scalp. For a moment, death reached out to claim the young conqueror before his legend had truly begun. Rusacus raised his sword for the killing blow, and time seemed to slow as the blade began its descent. But Clytus the Black, one of Alexander's bodyguards, spurred his horse forward and drove his spear through the Persian's back just as the sword began to fall. "The gods protect their own," Clytus said as he helped Alexander steady himself in the saddle. "But even the gods expect us to duck when swords are swinging at our heads." With their leaders dead and the Macedonian cavalry pouring across the river, the Persian line began to crumble. The Greek mercenaries in Persian service, professional soldiers who had fought for gold rather than glory, found themselves surrounded and outnumbered. They fought with desperate courage, but they were doomed from the moment Alexander's spear had pierced the first Persian noble. When the battle ended, the Granicus ran red with blood, and the flower of Persian nobility lay trampled in the mud. Alexander had won his first victory on Asian soil, but more importantly, he had sent a message that would echo throughout the empire. The young king from Macedon wasn't another barbarian raider seeking easy plunder. He was a conqueror of a different sort, one who combined the tactical brilliance of his father with a personal courage that inspired his men to follow him anywhere. The aftermath of the Granicus revealed another side of Alexander's character. The Persian dead were buried with honor, their bodies treated with the respect due to brave enemies. The Greek mercenaries who had fought against him were sent in chains to Macedonia, where they would work in the mines as punishment for betraying their own people. But the Persian nobles who survived the battle were ransomed back to their families, and their wounds were tended by Macedonian physicians. "We are not here to destroy," Alexander told his officers as they surveyed the battlefield. "We are here to build something new, something greater than has ever existed before. That cannot be accomplished by making every Persian our enemy. Some must be defeated, but others must be won over, convinced that our cause serves their interests as well as our own." The victory at the Granicus opened the gates of Asia Minor to the Macedonian army. City after city surrendered without a fight, their gates thrown open to welcome the liberators from the west. The Greek cities of the Aegean coast, which had languished under Persian rule for generations, greeted Alexander as the champion of Hellenic freedom. In Ephesus, the great temple of Artemis was rededicated to the goddess, and the priests proclaimed Alexander a new Achilles, sent by the gods to restore the balance of the world. But not all of Asia Minor submitted peacefully. The city of Halicarnassus, ruled by Memnon of Rhodes, the ablest general in Persian service, prepared to resist the Macedonian advance. Memnon had been absent from the Granicus, engaged in securing the Persian fleet, and he brought to the defense of Halicarnassus a strategic vision that his fallen comrades had lacked. The siege of Halicarnassus was Alexander's first taste of a new kind of warfare. Unlike the swift cavalry charges and massed infantry battles that had brought him victory at the Granicus, this was a grinding test of patience and engineering skill. The city's walls were strong, its garrison was well supplied, and Memnon commanded the sea approaches with a fleet that could bring reinforcements and supplies while keeping the Macedonians isolated on the landward side. For weeks the siege dragged on as Alexander's engineers struggled to find ways to breach the massive walls. Catapults hurled stones day and night. Siege towers crept forward under cover of shields and mantlets, and brave men died by the hundreds in desperate assaults that gained only yards of ground. It was a different kind of test than the young king had faced before, one that demanded not just courage and tactical skill, but also the patience to persist when quick victories proved impossible. The breakthrough came when Alexander's miners succeeded in undermining a section of the wall near the harbor. As the stones crashed down in a cloud of dust and debris, the Macedonian assault troops poured through the breach, fighting their way street by street towards the city's heart. But Memnon, recognizing that the position was hopeless, made a strategic withdrawal, evacuating his best troops by sea while leaving behind a skeleton garrison to slow the Macedonian advance. When Halicarnassus finally fell, Alexander found himself master of a city that had been largely destroyed in the fighting. The lesson was clear. Sieges were costly affairs that consumed time and men that could be better used elsewhere. In the future, he would try to avoid such grinding contests whenever possible, using speed and maneuver to avoid the need for lengthy sieges. But the fall of Halicarnassus had secured the Aegean coast, and with winter approaching, Alexander made a decision that showed his growing confidence in his ability to inspire loyalty among his enemies. Rather than keeping his entire army together, he divided his forces, sending Parmenion with the slower infantry to winter quarters, while he himself led the more mobile units on a campaign through the mountains of Lycia and Pamphylia. This winter campaign revealed yet another facet of Alexander's genius. The mountain tribes of Anatolia were fierce fighters who had never been fully conquered by any power, Persian or otherwise. Their strongholds were perched on seemingly impossible crags. Their warriors were skilled in guerrilla tactics, and their loyalty could not be bought with gold or won with threats. But Alexander approached them not as a conqueror seeking submission, but as a hero seeking worthy adversaries. He climbed their mountains, shared their campfires, and listened to their stories of ancient battles and legendary heroes. When he fought them, it was with a respect that honored their courage, and when he defeated them, it was with terms that preserved their dignity. One by one, the mountain tribes submitted to the young king, who seemed to understand them better than they understood themselves. By the time spring arrived, Alexander had secured his rear areas and recruited thousands of new soldiers from peoples who had never served under a foreign banner before. More importantly, he had demonstrated that his appeal was not limited to Greeks and Macedonians, but could extend to anyone who valued courage and honor above mere survival. As the campaigning season of 333 began, Alexander reunited his forces and prepared to march deeper into Asia. Behind him lay a string of victories that had established his reputation as a general of extraordinary ability. Ahead lay the heart of the Persian Empire, where Darius himself was gathering an army that would dwarf anything Alexander had faced before. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of two civilizations, a meeting between East and West that would reshape the ancient world. Alexander had proven himself at the Granicus and Halicarnassus, but the greatest tests of his courage, his wisdom, and his destiny still lay ahead. Standing on the plains of Asia Minor, with the snow-capped peaks of the Taurus Mountains rising before him, and the blue waters of the Mediterranean stretching away to his right, Alexander must have felt the weight of history pressing upon his shoulders. He had crossed the gates of Asia and won his first victories. But the real adventure was just beginning. The young king who had once played among the olive trees of Pella was now the master of lands that stretched from the Hellespont to the borders of Syria. But in his heart he knew that this was only the beginning of a story that would either end in the greatest triumph in human history or in a grave far from the familiar hills of Macedon. Either way, there could be no turning back. The die had been cast, the Rubicon had been crossed, and Alexander the Great was marching toward his destiny with the confidence of a man who believed that the world itself was barely large enough to contain his dreams. The narrow pass through the Cilician gates opened like a doorway between worlds, revealing the broad plains of Syria spread beneath the autumn sun. As Alexander's army descended from the Taurus Mountains, the soldiers could see in the distance the glittering waters of the Mediterranean and the ancient cities that dotted the coastline like jewels on a necklace. They were entering the heartland of the Persian Empire, where the great king's authority had been unquestioned for 2 centuries. But Darius III was no longer the distant figure on a throne that he had been when Alexander first crossed the Hellespont. The Persian king had gathered the largest army in the history of the world, drawing soldiers from every corner of his vast empire. Scythian horsemen from the steppes, Indian war elephants, Mesopotamian chariots, and the elite guard known as the Immortals all had answered their king's summons. 600,000 men, it was said, had assembled under the golden banner of Persia. The 2 armies met at Issus, a narrow coastal plain where the mountains pressed close to the sea, limiting the space for maneuver. It was terrain that favored the smaller, more disciplined Macedonian force over the vast but unwieldy Persian host. Darius, in his eagerness to bring the upstart Greek king to battle, had chosen ground that negated his greatest advantage, the sheer weight of numbers. Alexander spent the night before the battle walking among his soldiers, sharing their fires and listening to their concerns. These men had followed him from the familiar hills of Macedon to this distant shore, trusting in his leadership and believing in his vision of glory. Now, on the eve of the greatest battle of their lives, he wanted them to know that their king understood the magnitude of what they faced together. "Tomorrow," he said to a group of veterans from the phalanx, we face the great king himself. Not his satraps or his mercenaries, but Darius in person, with all the might of Asia at his back. Some of you are thinking that we are mad to challenge such odds, and perhaps you are right. But remember this: they may have the numbers, but we have the cause. They fight for a king who rules them through fear. We fight for each other, and for the dream of something greater than any of us could achieve alone. When dawn came, Alexander arrayed his forces with the precision of a master craftsman setting gems in a crown. The phalanx held the center, their bronze spear points forming a wall of death that had never known defeat. On the right, Alexander himself led the companion cavalry, ready to strike the decisive blow at the crucial moment. On the left, Parmenion commanded the Thessalian horse and allied infantry, solid and dependable as the mountains of their homeland. Across the narrow plain, the Persian army spread like a glittering tapestry of silk and gold. At its heart stood Darius himself, magnificent in his chariot of ivory and gold, surrounded by the flower of Persian nobility. To European eyes, accustomed to the simple leather and bronze of Greek warfare, the Eastern host must have seemed like something from a dream. All flowing robes and curved swords, exotic weapons, and strange battle cries in a dozen different languages. But Alexander saw through the pageantry to the weakness beneath. For all their numbers and splendor, the Persians were fighting far from their homes, led by a king who had never known defeat because he had never truly been tested. They were like a magnificent tapestry that would tear at the first strong pull, beautiful to look upon, but lacking the strong threads that held Greek armies together. The battle began with a charge by the Persian cavalry against the Macedonian left wing. For a moment, it seemed that Parmenion's forces might be overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the attack. But these were not the soft troops of Western Asia Minor, but veteran soldiers who had learned their trade in the mountain wars of Philip's reign. They bent before the Persian charge like a strong tree before a storm, but they did not break. In the center, the phalanx advanced with the inexorable precision of a machine built for war. The Persian infantry, brave enough as individuals but lacking the discipline and training of their enemies, tried to stand against the bronze-tipped hedge of spears. But no force on earth could stand against the Macedonian phalanx when it was properly supported and led with skill. The decisive moment came when Alexander spotted his opportunity. Through the dust and chaos of battle, he saw that Darius had committed his reserves to support the cavalry attack on the left. The Persian center, though still formidable, was thinner than it had been, and there was a gap where the infantry line had been stretched to accommodate the great king's chariot. With a cry that echoed across the battlefield, Alexander led his companions in a wedge-shaped charge that drove like a spear point toward the heart of the Persian army. The young king rode at the very tip of the formation, his shield of Achilles gleaming in the sun, his spear accounting for enemy after enemy as Bucephalus carried him through the press of battle. The Persian nobles who surrounded Darius fought with desperate courage, knowing that the fate of their empire depended on their ability to protect their king. But they were facing not just another enemy, but a force of nature. a young man who seemed to bear the blessing of the gods themselves. Alexander's spear found gaps in armor that should have been impenetrable. His horse moved with a grace that carried him past sword strokes that should have been fatal. When the companion cavalry broke through the Persian line and began to close on Darius himself, panic seized the great king. Perhaps he remembered the fate of his ancestors who had fallen to Greek spears at Marathon and Plataea. Perhaps he saw in Alexander's approach the hand of destiny itself, reaching out to claim the throne of Asia. Whatever the reason, Darius turned his chariot and fled the field, abandoning his army to its fate. The sight of their king in flight broke the heart of Persian resistance. What had been an army became a mob, and what had been a battle became a rout. As the sun set over the Mediterranean, the greatest host in the history of the world was scattered like leaves before the wind, and Alexander stood master of the battlefield. But the true prize of Issus was not the victory itself, but what was found in the Persian camp. Darius, in his haste to escape, had abandoned not only his army, but his family as well. The great king's mother, wife, and children were taken prisoner, along with a treasure that defied description, the accumulated wealth of the mightiest empire on earth. Alexander's treatment of the royal prisoners revealed the depth of character that would define his reign. Rather than parading them through the streets as trophies of war, he ordered that they be treated with the respect due to their station. The Queen Mother, Sisygambis, was given quarters befitting her rank and assured that her family would suffer no harm at Macedonian hands. When Alexander came to pay his respects to the captive royal family, dressed in his finest robes and accompanied by Hephaestion, the elderly Queen Mother made a mistake that could have proved fatal. Seeing the taller and more conventionally handsome Hephaestion, she assumed he was the king and began to prostrate herself before him. When her error was pointed out, she was mortified, certain that she had given mortal offense to her captor. But Alexander, with the grace that would win him more followers than any sword, simply smiled and helped the old woman to her feet. "You were not wrong, mother," he said, using the title of respect due to her age and station. For he, too, is Alexander. This simple act of courtesy, this refusal to humiliate a defeated enemy, did more to win Alexander the loyalty of his Persian subjects than any number of military victories could have accomplished. Word of the young king's magnanimity spread throughout the empire, and many who had been prepared to resist the Macedonian advance began to wonder if perhaps this Western conqueror was different from the barbarian raiders they had expected. From Issus, Alexander could have marched directly on Babylon and Susa, the twin hearts of the Persian Empire. Darius was in full retreat, his army shattered, his authority severely weakened. A swift advance might have ended the war in a single campaign, bringing the greatest empire on earth under Macedonian rule. But Alexander had learned from his father the importance of securing one's flanks before advancing into enemy territory. The Persian fleet still controlled the eastern Mediterranean, and the great cities of Phoenicia remained unconquered. Until these strongholds were reduced, any advance into Mesopotamia would leave the Macedonian lines of communication dangerously exposed. The siege of Tyre would test Alexander's determination and ingenuity as no battle had done before. The ancient Phoenician city was built on an island half a mile from shore, protected by massive walls and supplied by the sea. For centuries, it had been considered impregnable, and its merchants had grown rich and proud in the confidence of their security. When Alexander demanded the city's surrender, the Tyrians laughed. Let the young king wear out his army against walls he could never breach. Let him waste months in a futile siege while Darius gathered new forces in the east. Tyre had resisted Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus, and it would resist this upstart Greek as well. But Alexander was not deterred by the apparent impossibility of the task. If Tyre was protected by the sea, then he would remove the sea's protection. Calling upon the engineering skills that had made Macedonian siegecraft the finest in the world, he ordered the construction of a causeway, a great mole of stone and earth that would connect the island to the mainland. The work proceeded slowly, under constant harassment from the Tyrian fleet and the city's defenders. Every day brought new challenges as the water grew deeper and the Tyrian resistance more desperate. Ships filled with combustibles were sailed against the growing causeway and set afire. Siege engines were destroyed by surprise attacks, and brave men died by the dozens in the muddy shallows between shore and city. The Tyrians, growing desperate, resorted to increasingly savage tactics. Prisoners taken in the fighting were tortured and murdered on the city walls where the Macedonians could see them. In response, Alexander ordered that no quarter be given when the city finally fell. The ancient laws of war were clear. A city that refused honorable surrender and resorted to atrocities forfeited any claim to mercy. After 7 months of grinding siege warfare, the causeway was complete, and Macedonian siege engines could be brought to bear against the city walls. The assault that followed was terrible in its intensity, a concentrated expression of months of frustration and anger. When the walls were finally breached and the Macedonians poured into the city, the sack of Tyre became a byword for the price of defying Alexander's will. 8,000 Tyrians died in the fighting, and 30,000 were sold into slavery. The city that had once been the jewel of the eastern Mediterranean was left a smoking ruin, its power broken forever. But from the ashes of Tyre rose something new, the proof that no fortress was strong enough to stop the Macedonian advance, no obstacle too great for Alexander's will to overcome. With Tyre destroyed and the Phoenician coast secured, Alexander turned his attention to the south, where Egypt waited like a ripe fruit, ready to be plucked. The ancient land of the pharaohs had chafed under Persian rule for generations, and the priests of Memphis and Thebes had long prophesied the coming of a liberator from the west. The Persian satrap of Egypt offered no resistance to the Macedonian advance. With his army destroyed at Issus and his fleet scattered by the fall of Tyre, he had no choice but to open the gates of Memphis and surrender the richest province in the empire. Alexander entered Egypt not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, welcomed by crowds who saw in him the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. At Memphis, the ancient capital of the pharaohs, Alexander performed the sacred rituals that made him legitimate ruler of Egypt in the eyes of the gods and the people. Crowned with the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, he became not just a Macedonian king ruling foreign subjects, but a pharaoh in the full sense of the word, heir to a tradition that stretched back to the dawn of civilization. But it was not enough for Alexander to rule Egypt. He wanted to understand it. Leaving the administrative details to trusted subordinates, he embarked on a journey that would take him into the heart of the Egyptian desert, to the oracle of Ammon at the oasis of Siwa. The journey to Siwa was fraught with danger. The desert was a trackless waste where armies had vanished without trace, where the sun could kill as surely as any sword, and the shifting sands hid dangers that civilized men could barely imagine. But Alexander was driven by a need that transcended mere curiosity. He had come to believe that his successes were too great, his luck too consistent, to be the product of mortal effort alone. Perhaps the gods themselves had chosen him for some great purpose, some destiny that even he didn't yet fully understand. The Oracle of Ammon was ancient when the pyramids were young, a shrine where the god spoke through his priests to those who sought divine guidance. As Alexander approached the sacred oasis, he must have wondered what answers he would find to the questions that had haunted him since childhood. Was he truly the son of Philip, or had some god touched his mother on the night of his conception? Was his destiny to rule merely Macedon and Greece, or did the gods have some greater purpose in mind? What passed between Alexander and the Oracle of Ammon was never fully revealed. The young king emerged from the sacred chamber with a smile that seemed to hold secrets, and when pressed by his companions for details, he would only say that he had learned what he needed to know. But from that day forward, there was a new confidence in his bearing, a certainty that seemed to come from divine rather than mortal sources. The priests of Ammon, for their part, proclaimed Alexander the son of Zeus Ammon, a god in human form sent to restore the balance of the world. Whether they spoke from divine inspiration or political calculation mattered less than the effect their words had throughout Egypt and beyond. The young king who had entered the desert as a mortal conqueror emerged as something more, a figure touched by divinity itself. But perhaps the most lasting achievement of Alexander's time in Egypt was not his consultations with the oracle, but his founding of a new city at the mouth of the Nile. Alexandria, as he named it, was positioned to become the greatest port on the Mediterranean, a bridge between the ancient wisdom of Egypt and the dynamic culture of Greece. Standing on the site where his new city would rise, looking out over the harbor that would one day shelter the ships of the world, Alexander must have felt the satisfaction of a man who was building something that would outlast his own mortal frame. Conquests could be reversed, empires could fall, but a city built in the right place, with the right purpose, could endure for millennia. The founding of Alexandria marked the end of Alexander's time in Egypt, but it also marked a transformation in his understanding of his own mission. He had entered the land of the pharaohs as a Macedonian king seeking to consolidate his conquests. He left as something greater, a figure who had been touched by the divine and charged with a destiny that stretched beyond the borders of any single kingdom. As his army prepared to march east toward the final confrontation with Darius, Alexander looked back one last time at the city that bore his name. The buildings were still only lines in the sand, the harbors still only dreams in the minds of architects, but he could see it all as clearly as if it already existed. The lighthouse that would guide ships safely to port, the library that would preserve the wisdom of ages, the scholars and merchants and artists who would make Alexandria the jewel of the Mediterranean world. The pharaoh and the conqueror had become one, and from that union would come achievements that would outlast the pyramids themselves. But first, there was still an empire to win and a destiny to fulfill. Somewhere in the east, Darius was gathering his strength for one final throw of the dice, and the greatest battle in the history of the world was waiting to be fought. Alexander had proven himself a master of war and diplomacy, a king worthy of his father's crown and his mother's dreams. But the greatest test of his character and his destiny still lay ahead, on the plains of Mesopotamia, where the fate of two civilizations would be decided once and for all. The young king who had once played among the olive trees of Pella was now the master of lands that stretched from the Hellespont to the cataracts of the Nile. But in his heart, he knew that this was still only the beginning of a story that would either end in the greatest triumph in human history or in a grave far from the familiar hills of Macedon. The great plain of Gaugamela stretched endlessly beneath the October sun, a vast stage prepared by fate for the final act of the drama that had begun when Alexander first crossed the Hellespont. Here, near the ancient city of Arbela, Darius III had chosen to make his ultimate stand, gathering from the farthest reaches of his empire an army that surpassed even the host that had been shattered at Issus. For months the great king had prepared for this moment. The lessons of his previous defeats had not been lost on him, and this time he had chosen the battlefield with care. The plain was broad and level, perfect for the deployment of his massive forces and the maneuvers of his cavalry and chariots. The ground had been cleared of obstacles, leveled and smoothed until it resembled a parade ground more than a natural battlefield. From the hills that overlooked the plain, the Persian army spread like a vast carpet woven from the many nations of the east. Bactrian cavalry from the steppes beyond the Oxus, war elephants from India with their towers of archers, scythed chariots from the workshops of Babylon, and at the center, the immortals of the royal guard, 10,000 strong and armored in gold and silver. It was said that 1,000,000 men had answered Darius's call, though the true number, while smaller, was still greater than any force that had ever been assembled under a single banner. Alexander's army, by contrast, seemed almost pitifully small as it descended from the foothills onto the plain. 47,000 men, dusty from their long march through the mountains of Media, tired from months of campaigning in hostile territory. But these soldiers had followed their king from the shores of the Aegean to the banks of the Tigris, and they had never known defeat. In their ranks marched the finest infantry in the world, the Macedonian phalanx that had broken every enemy formation it had ever faced. The night before the battle, Alexander could not sleep. While his soldiers rested in their camps, the young king walked among them, checking their weapons and armor, speaking quietly with officers and common soldiers alike. In the darkness, with only the stars as witnesses, he seemed less like the god-touched Pharaoh of Egypt and more like what he had always been at heart. A young man far from home, carrying the hopes and fears of everyone who trusted him. "Tomorrow," he said to Parmenion as they stood at the edge of the camp, looking out at the distant fires of the Persian host, "we decide whether Alexander the Great was a brief dream or the beginning of a new age. Everything we have fought for, everything we have built, comes down to what happens when the sun rises." The old general, Philip's most trusted lieutenant and Alexander's most cautious advisor, studied the vast enemy encampment with the eye of a professional soldier. "The odds are long, my king," he said quietly. "Longer than at the Granicus or Issus. Darius has learned from his defeats, and this time he has the ground of his choosing and numbers that would make even your father pause." Alexander smiled, the same confident smile that had reassured his soldiers through a dozen battles. "Numbers mean nothing if they cannot be properly used. Darius has a mob, not an army. When the test comes, we shall see whether the sons of Macedon are still the equals of any 10 barbarians." But beneath the bravado, Alexander knew that Parmenion was right. The coming battle would be the greatest test of his career, a trial that would either confirm his destiny or end it in a grave on the plains of Mesopotamia. Everything he had learned from Aristotle about strategy and tactics, everything he had inherited from Philip about leadership and war, everything he had discovered about himself on the long road from Pella to Gaugamela would be put to the ultimate test. As dawn approached, Alexander performed the sacrifices required by tradition and custom. The omens were favorable, the priests reported, and the gods smiled upon the Macedonian cause. Whether or not the young king believed in the literal truth of such pronouncements mattered less than their effect on his soldiers. They had seen him blessed by the oracle of Ammon, had watched him perform miracles of courage and leadership, and they were ready to follow him into battle with the confidence of men who served a king chosen by the gods themselves. The Persian attack began before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, a magnificent and terrifying spectacle that would have broken the nerve of lesser men. First came the scythed chariots, those wheeled engines of destruction that had scattered the armies of the pharaohs in ages past. Their bronze blades glittered in the morning light as they thundered across the plain, their drivers whipping their horses to greater speed, their war cries echoing across the battlefield. But the Macedonian phalanx had faced chariots before, and they had learned the secret of defeating them. As the Persian vehicles approached, the infantry opened lanes in their formation, allowing the chariots to pass through harmlessly, while javelin throwers and archers picked off the drivers and horses. Those few chariots that did reach the Macedonian line intact were quickly overwhelmed by soldiers who had trained specifically for this moment. Behind the chariots came the Persian cavalry, wave after wave of horsemen in silk and mail, their curved swords flashing as they sought to roll up the Macedonian flanks. On the left, Parmenion's Thessalians and allied infantry bent before the assault, but did not break, fighting with the stubborn courage that had made them Philip's most trusted soldiers. On the right, the companion cavalry met their opposite numbers in a clash that shook the earth and sent dust clouds spiraling into the sky. But Alexander was not content to fight a defensive battle, trading casualties while waiting for the enemy to exhaust himself. As the Persian cavalry committed itself to the attacks on his flanks, he saw the opportunity he had been waiting for. In the center of the enemy line, where Darius sat in his golden chariot, surrounded by the flower of Persian nobility, a gap had opened as reserves were sent to reinforce the cavalry attacks. With a cry that cut through the din of battle like a blade through silk, Alexander led his personal guard in the charge that would decide the fate of empires. The young king rode at the head of a wedge formation, his companions arranged behind him in perfect order, their spears leveled and their shields locked. They struck the Persian line like a thunderbolt from Zeus himself, driving deep into the heart of the enemy formation. The fighting around Darius's chariot was the fiercest of Alexander's career. The Persian nobles who guarded their king were brave men fighting for their homes and families, and they sold their lives dearly. But they were facing not just superior soldiers, but a force of nature, a young man who seemed to bear the blessing of all the gods of war. Alexander's spear shattered against a Persian shield, and he drew his sword, the blade that had been blessed by the priests of Athena and consecrated in the blood of a dozen battles. Around him, his companions fought with the fury of wolves, each man knowing that the fate of their king and their cause depended on their courage and skill. The moment of decision came when Darius himself was unhorsed, his chariot overturned in the press of battle. For an instant, the great king and the Macedonian conqueror faced each other across the chaos of war, and the entire history of the ancient world seemed to hang in the balance. Here was the heir of Cyrus and Xerxes, the master of nations, the king of kings, facing a young man from the mountains of Macedon who claimed to be the son of a god. But Darius, like his predecessor at Issus, chose discretion over valor. Mounting a spare horse, he fled the field, leaving his army to its fate. The sight of their king in flight broke the spirit of Persian resistance, and what had been the greatest army in the history of the world became a fleeing mob, scattered by the desert wind. As the sun set over Gaugamela, Alexander stood victorious in the ruins of Persian power. The treasures of Babylon and Susa lay open to him, the richest cities in the world waiting to acknowledge a new master. More importantly, the myth of Persian invincibility had been shattered forever, and the young king from Macedon had proven himself the greatest general of his age. The immediate aftermath of Gaugamela revealed the true magnitude of Alexander's achievement. For 2 centuries, the Persian Empire had been the dominant power in the known world, its authority unchallenged from the Aegean to the Indus. Now, in the space of a single afternoon, that empire had collapsed like a house built on sand. Babylon, the greatest city in Mesopotamia, opened its gates without a fight. The Persian satrap, recognizing that resistance was futile, surrendered the city and its treasures to the Macedonian king. As Alexander entered through the famous Ishtar Gate, he was greeted by crowds who saw in him not a foreign conqueror, but a liberator who had freed them from the burden of Persian taxation and Persian rule. In the ziggurat of Marduk, the ancient patron god of Babylon, Alexander performed the rituals that made him legitimate ruler of Mesopotamia in the eyes of the local population. Like his coronation in Memphis, this ceremony was more than mere politics. It was a recognition that the young king understood the importance of winning not just military victories, but the loyalty and respect of his new subjects. From Babylon, the road led to Susa, the administrative capital of the Persian Empire and the repository of treasures accumulated over centuries of conquest. Here, in the palace of Darius, Alexander found wealth beyond imagination: golden vessels and precious stones, silk tapestries and ivory carvings, the artistic treasures of a dozen civilizations gathered in one place. But more precious than gold or jewels was what Alexander discovered in the royal archives. Here were the administrative records of the greatest empire in history, the carefully maintained documents that showed how the Persians had governed their vast domains. For a young king who dreamed of ruling the world, these scrolls and tablets were worth more than all the treasures of Croesus. The final prize awaited at Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire and the symbol of everything the great kings had built. As Alexander's army approached the city, they could see in the distance the great staircase and the towering columns of the audience hall where the representatives of subject nations had once brought tribute to their Persian masters. Persepolis was more than a city. It was a statement carved in stone, a declaration that the Persian king was the master of the world and all other rulers were merely his servants. For the Greeks, who had suffered under Persian invasions and Persian gold for generations, the city represented everything they had fought to overthrow. The sack of Persepolis was the most controversial act of Alexander's career. Whether it was planned or spontaneous, whether it was an act of policy or passion, remains a matter of historical debate. But when the fires were finally extinguished and the smoke cleared, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire lay in ruins, its palaces gutted and its treasures scattered. Some would later claim that Alexander regretted the destruction of Persepolis, that it was the act of a drunken youth rather than a mature king. But others saw in it a symbolic necessity, the final act in the drama of Greek revenge for the invasions of Darius and Xerxes. The burning of Persepolis was the funeral pyre of the old world, and from its ashes would rise something new and unprecedented. With the fall of Persepolis, the Persian Empire, in the traditional sense, ceased to exist. Darius III, the last of the Achaemenid kings, was a fugitive in his own domains, dependent on the loyalty of satraps who increasingly saw accommodation with Alexander as preferable to continued resistance. The young Macedonian had achieved in 4 years what no conqueror before him had even attempted: the complete overthrow of the greatest empire in human history. But Alexander's victory at Gaugamela and his subsequent conquests had done more than merely transfer power from Persian to Macedonian hands. They had fundamentally altered the balance of civilization, opening new possibilities for cultural exchange and political organization that had never existed before. The old world of isolated city-states and provincial kingdoms was giving way to something larger, a cosmopolitan empire that would span 3 continents and encompass dozens of different peoples and cultures. As Alexander stood in the ruins of Persepolis, watching the flames consume the monuments of Persian power, he must have felt the weight of what he had accomplished and the burden of what lay ahead. He had proven himself the greatest conqueror in history, but conquest was only the beginning. The real test would be whether he could build something lasting from the ashes of the old world, whether he could create an empire that was more than just the personal achievement of a single remarkable man. The young king who had once listened to his mother's stories of Achilles and the heroes of Troy had surpassed all the legends of the past. But like those ancient heroes, he would discover that the greatest victories sometimes carry the seeds of the greatest tragedies, and that the gods who grant mortals their deepest desires often exact a price that cannot be calculated until it is too late to turn back. The fall of Persia was complete, but Alexander's destiny was far from fulfilled. Somewhere in the mountains of the east, new challenges awaited, new enemies to face, and new worlds to conquer. The greatest adventure in human history was only half complete, and the most difficult tests of character and leadership still lay ahead on the long road that would lead eventually to India, to the edge of the known world, and to a final reckoning with the limits of mortal ambition. Beyond the ruins of Persepolis lay a world that few Greeks had ever imagined, a vast expanse of mountains and deserts, steppes and rivers, where the very names of kingdoms were whispers carried on the wind. This was the far east of the Persian Empire, where the authority of the great king had always been more theoretical than real, where local chieftains ruled in their mountain fastnesses and nomad tribes followed the ancient rhythms of migration and war. Here, in the lands beyond the Indus River, Alexander would face his greatest challenges not as a general commanding disciplined armies, but as a leader struggling to hold together an expedition that was pushing beyond the limits of the known world. The soldiers who had followed him from Macedonia had already marched farther than any Greek army in history, had conquered more territory than their fathers had ever dreamed existed. Now they were being asked to follow their king into regions that existed only in the tales of merchants and the songs of wandering poets. The pursuit of Darius III had led Alexander deep into the eastern provinces of the collapsed Persian Empire. The last Achaemenid king, stripped of his armies and his authority, had become a fugitive, seeking shelter among the satraps who had once bowed before his throne. But the loyalty that had sustained the Persian Empire for 2 centuries was crumbling along with its military power, and even Darius's most trusted supporters began to see him as a liability rather than a legitimate ruler. The end came in the summer of 330 BCE in the desert wastes of Bactria. Bessus, satrap of Bactria and cousin to the great king, made a calculation as cold as it was pragmatic. Darius alive was a symbol of resistance that would draw Alexander deeper into the east. Darius dead would remove the primary reason for the Macedonian advance and perhaps allow the eastern provinces to negotiate their own accommodation with the conqueror. When Alexander's advance guard found the body of Darius by the roadside, pierced by the spears of his own followers, the young king felt a mixture of satisfaction and regret. The great enemy who had haunted his dreams since childhood was finally dead, but the manner of his death robbed the moment of any sense of triumph. This was not how the last act of the Persian Empire should have ended, not with betrayal and murder in the desert, but with an honorable surrender between worthy enemies. Alexander ordered that Darius be buried with the honors due to a king, his body wrapped in purple and gold and carried back to Persepolis for interment with his ancestors. It was a gesture that cost nothing in practical terms, but spoke volumes about the kind of ruler Alexander intended to be. He was not merely a destroyer of empires, but a builder of something new, and that something could require the loyalty and respect of all his subjects, Persian as well as Greek. But the death of Darius did not end the war in the east. If anything, it marked the beginning of a new and more difficult phase of the campaign. Bessus, the regicide, proclaimed himself great king and heir to the Achaemenid throne, rallying the scattered remnants of Persian power for a final stand against the Macedonian advance. Other local rulers, seeing opportunity in chaos, declared their own independence and prepared to resist the foreign conqueror. The campaigns that followed tested Alexander's abilities as never before. This was not the kind of warfare he had learned from his father or studied in the histories of great battles. There were no pitched engagements between disciplined armies, no decisive victories that could settle the fate of provinces with a single stroke. Instead, there was guerrilla warfare in mountain passes, sieges of seemingly impregnable fortresses, and the constant attrition of men and supplies in hostile territory. In the Hindu Kush, that great barrier of peaks and glaciers that separates Central Asia from India, Alexander's army struggled through passes that existed above the clouds themselves. The air was so thin that men gasped for breath with every step, and the cold was so bitter that it claimed more lives than all the battles they had fought. But the young king drove them forward with a will that seemed to draw strength from the very obstacles that would have stopped lesser men. "We are writing our names in the book of the gods," he told his officers as they struggled through a pass that the locals claimed was the pathway to heaven itself. "Every step we take carries us farther from the familiar world and closer to immortality. When men speak of what mortals can achieve, they will measure themselves against what we have done in these mountains." The siege of the Sogdian Rock marked the culmination of Alexander's war in the eastern provinces. Here, on a pinnacle of stone that rose from the desert like a finger pointing toward the sky, the local chieftain Oxyates had built what he believed to be an impregnable fortress. The walls were carved from the living rock. The approaches were guarded by precipices that would challenge an eagle, and the garrison was supplied by springs that had never been known to fail. When Alexander arrived at the base of the rock and demanded the fortress's surrender, Oxyates laughed from his lofty perch. "Send for birds, Macedonian," he called down, "for only creatures with wings will ever reach this place." But Alexander had not come so far to be stopped by mere geography. Calling for volunteers among his most experienced mountain fighters, he offered magnificent rewards to any man who could find a way to scale the impossible cliff. Through the long winter nights, these brave soldiers crept up the rock face like human spiders, carrying their weapons and equipment on their backs, following cracks and ledges that would have defeated the most skilled mountaineers. When dawn broke and Oxyates looked up to see Macedonian banners flying from the peaks above his fortress, his defiance crumbled into amazement. The impossible had been accomplished, and the impregnable rock was now commanded by the very birds he had mockingly summoned. The garrison surrendered without further resistance, awed by a demonstration of determination that seemed to transcend human limitations. Among the captives taken at the Sogdian rock was Oxyates' daughter, Roxane, a young woman whose beauty was matched only by her fierce pride. She had expected to be treated as a prize of war, to be divided among the conquerors like any other piece of valuable plunder. Instead, she found herself face to face with a king who seemed to see in her not just a symbol of his victory, but a person worthy of respect and consideration. Alexander's marriage to Roxane was both a political masterstroke and a personal revelation. By taking a Bactrian princess as his wife, he demonstrated to the peoples of the East that he was not merely a foreign conqueror, but a legitimate ruler who honored their customs and valued their contributions to his growing empire. For the Macedonian officers who had followed him from childhood, however, the marriage was deeply troubling, a sign that their king was becoming something alien and Eastern. The wedding celebration at Balk, ancient capital of Bactria, revealed the tensions that were growing within Alexander's inner circle. On one side sat the Macedonian and Greek officers, veterans of the campaigns from the Granicus to Gaugamela, watching with barely concealed distaste as their king participated in Persian ceremonies and adopted Eastern customs. On the other side sat the Persian nobles and Eastern chieftains who had submitted to Alexander's rule, equally uncomfortable with practices that seemed to honor barbarian traditions above their own ancient ways. But Alexander himself seemed oblivious to these tensions, caught up in the vision of an empire that would transcend the narrow loyalties of race and nation. In Roxane, he saw not just a beautiful wife, but a symbol of the new world he was creating, a world where Greek and Persian, Macedonian and Bactrian could unite under a single crown and march together toward a common destiny. The vision was magnificent, but it carried within it the seeds of tragedy. The marriage to Roxane marked the beginning of Alexander's gradual alienation from the soldiers and officers who had been his companions since youth. They had followed him to the ends of the earth out of personal loyalty and shared purpose, but they couldn't follow him into a transformation that seemed to deny the very values that had made them great. The crisis came to a head during the winter spent in Samarkand, the jewel of Sogdiana. At a banquet honoring the Persian custom of prostration before the king, the tension between East and West exploded into open conflict. Callisthenes, the court historian and Aristotle's nephew, refused to perform the ritual that would acknowledge Alexander's divinity, declaring that no free Greek would ever bow before any mortal man. The argument that followed revealed the depth of the philosophical divide that was opening within the Macedonian court. Alexander, influenced by years of Eastern custom and the flattery of Persian courtiers, had begun to believe in his own divine nature. His followers, raised in the democratic traditions of Greece and the rough equality of Macedonian military life, saw such pretensions as both blasphemous and politically dangerous. The confrontation with Callisthenes ended badly for both men. The historian was arrested on charges of treason and conspiracy, eventually dying in prison under circumstances that cast a shadow over Alexander's claim to justice and mercy. For Alexander, the incident marked another step in his journey away from the simple soldier king he had once been toward something more complex and ultimately more isolated. But personal conflicts and philosophical disputes could not stop the momentum of conquest that had carried Alexander's army across half the known world. Beyond the mountains of the Hindu Kush lay India, a land of legendary wealth and exotic wonders that had existed in Greek imagination more as myth than in reality. Here were said to be cities with walls of gold, warriors who rode elephants into battle, and philosophers who could predict the future from the flight of birds. The decision to cross the Indus and invade India was Alexander's alone, taken against the advice of his most experienced officers. The army was tired after years of continuous campaigning. The supply lines stretched back thousands of miles to Macedonia, and the soldiers grumbled that they had already conquered more territory than they could effectively govern. But the young king was driven by a compulsion that went beyond mere ambition, a need to see what lay beyond the next mountain range, to push the boundaries of the possible until he reached the very edge of the world. The crossing of the Indus in the spring of 326 BCE marked the beginning of Alexander's Indian campaigns, the most exotic and dangerous phase of his entire career. The river itself was a mighty barrier, wider than any waterway the Macedonians had encountered, its swift current carrying the debris of distant mountains and the occasional crocodile that reminded the soldiers they were entering a world governed by different rules. On the eastern bank of the Indus waited Omphis, Raja of Taxila, with gifts that staggered even veterans who had seen the treasures of Babylon and Persepolis. There were elephants trained for war, their tusks sheathed in bronze and their backs carrying towers filled with archers. There were warriors in silk and steel, armed with weapons of strange design and exotic effectiveness. There were courtesans and dancing girls, spices and precious stones, all the wealth and wonder of a civilization that had flourished for millennia in isolation from the Western world. But not all the Indian rulers were prepared to submit peacefully to Macedonian rule. Beyond Taxila lay the kingdom of Porus, a Raja whose pride matched his power and whose military strength had never been successfully challenged by any foreign invader. When Alexander's messengers demanded his submission, Porus replied with the dignity that would mark him as one of the noblest enemies the Macedonian king ever faced. "Tell your master," Porus said, "that he will find me waiting at the boundary of my kingdom, not to surrender like a coward, but to fight like a king. If he desires my submission, let him come and take it with his sword." The Battle of the Hydaspes, fought in the monsoon season of 326 BCE, was unlike any engagement in Alexander's career. The Indian army was built around war elephants, massive creatures that served as living fortresses. their trunks and tusks as dangerous as any weapon forged by human hands. Behind them stood infantry armed with long bamboo lances and powerful composite bows, while cavalry mounted on swift Indian horses protected the flanks. Porus himself was a giant of a man, standing head and shoulders above even the tallest of his warriors, riding an elephant that was larger and fiercer than any creature the Macedonians had ever seen. When Alexander first caught sight of his enemy across the rain-swollen river, he felt a stir of admiration for this king who faced impossible odds with such magnificent dignity. The battle itself was a masterpiece of tactical innovation. Alexander, recognizing that a direct assault across the river would be suicidal, divided his forces and launched a complex night maneuver that brought him across the Hydaspes at an unexpected point, catching Porus with only part of his army ready for battle. But even caught at a disadvantage, the Indian king fought with a courage that won the respect of his enemies. His elephants charged the Macedonian phalanx with a fury that initially broke the disciplined ranks, and for a time it seemed that Alexander might face his first serious defeat. But the Macedonians adapted to the new threat with the flexibility that had made them masters of the world, using their sarissas to wound the elephants and drive them back in confusion among their own troops. The decisive moment came when Alexander, leading his companion cavalry in one of his characteristic charges, broke through the Indian line and captured Porus's elephant. The great king, wounded but still defiant, found himself a prisoner facing the man who had conquered half the world. The conversation between the two monarchs, as recorded by the court historians, revealed the nobility that could exist even in the midst of warfare. When Alexander asked how Porus wished to be treated, the Indian king replied simply, "As befits a king." Alexander, recognizing in his prisoner the same royal dignity that he hoped to embody himself, not only restored Porus to his throne, but added new territories to his kingdom. The magnanimity shown to Porus was typical of Alexander at his best, demonstrating the vision that made him more than just another conqueror. But the victory at the Hydaspes also marked the beginning of the end of his great adventure. The monsoon rains that had made the battle so difficult continued for months, turning the countryside into a vast swamp where diseases unknown to European medicine claimed more lives than all the battles combined. More seriously, the army itself was beginning to show signs of strain that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. These men had followed their king for 8 years and thousands of miles through deserts and mountains, across rivers and seas, to lands that existed beyond the edge of their maps. They had conquered the greatest empire in history and gathered treasures beyond counting, but they were no longer the young soldiers who had crossed the Hellespont with dreams of glory dancing in their heads. The crisis came at the Hyphasis River, the easternmost point of Alexander's advance. Here, the army simply refused to go farther. It was not a mutiny in the traditional sense, with violence and bloodshed, but rather a collective expression of war weariness and homesickness that even Alexander's legendary persuasive powers could not overcome. For 3 days, the king remained alone in his tent, hoping that his absence would bring the soldiers to their senses and rekindle their enthusiasm for further conquest. But when he finally emerged to face his army, he found them still adamant in their refusal to advance. They had given him their youth and their courage. They had followed him to places that existed only in legends, but they would follow him no farther. The speech that Alexander delivered to his assembled army was perhaps the most moving of his career, a mixture of disappointment and understanding that revealed the depth of his love for the men who had shared his greatest adventures. He did not rage at their defiance or threaten punishment for their disobedience. Instead, he acknowledged their sacrifices and accepted their decision with the grace of a king who understood that even the greatest leaders must sometimes yield to the will of those they lead. "You have given me everything," he told them, his voice carrying across the silent ranks like a prayer. "Your courage, your loyalty, your very lives have been placed at my disposal, and I have spent them in pursuit of a dream that perhaps was too large for any mortal man to achieve. If you wish to see your homes again, to embrace your wives and children, to rest in the shade of familiar trees, then I will not stand in your way. We will turn back, and history will record that we came farther than any men before us, that we saw wonders beyond imagining, and that we proved that nothing is impossible for those who dare greatly." The decision to turn back from the Hyphasis marked the end of Alexander's conquests, though he would live and campaign for 3 more years. The army that began the long journey home was different from the one that had crossed the Hellespont, aged not just by the passage of time, but by experiences that had transformed them from provincial soldiers into citizens of the world. The return journey would test Alexander's leadership in new ways as he struggled to hold together an empire that stretched across 3 continents and encompassed dozens of different peoples and cultures. The vision of a unified world that had driven him to the edge of the earth would face its greatest challenges not from external enemies, but from the internal contradictions that no amount of military genius could resolve. But for now, as the Macedonian army began its slow march westward from the rivers of India, Alexander could reflect on achievements that had already surpassed those of every hero in Greek legend. He had proven himself the greatest conqueror in human history, had built an empire larger than any that had come before, and had carried the banner of Greek civilization to the very ends of the earth. The boy from Macedon had become the master of the world, but in achieving his greatest triumph, he had also discovered the loneliness that comes to those who climb so high that no one else can follow. The journey home would test whether the man who had conquered everything could find a way to rule what he had won, whether the greatest military genius in history could prove himself equally gifted as a builder of the peace. The great march home began like a funeral procession, slow and solemn under the merciless Indian sun. Along the banks of the Hydaspes, Alexander's engineers constructed a fleet of vessels to carry the army down the river system that would eventually lead them to the Arabian Sea and the long journey back to the familiar shores of the Mediterranean. But this was not the triumphant return of a victorious army, flush with conquest and eager to display their trophies. This was the retreat of men who had seen too much, done too much, traveled too far from the simple certainties of their youth. The soldiers who loaded their equipment onto the river barges were no longer the young warriors who had crossed the Hellespont 8 years before. They were veterans now, scarred by battle and weathered by climate, carrying in their eyes the distant look of men who had walked with gods and heroes. Many bore wounds that would never fully heal, injuries gathered in forgotten skirmishes against enemies whose names they could no longer pronounce. Others carried subtler damage, the invisible scars left by homesickness and exhaustion, by the constant strain of living always on the edge of the known world. Alexander himself seemed changed by the decision to turn back from the Hyphasis. The young king, who had once driven his army forward with infectious enthusiasm, now appeared brooding and distant, as if part of his spirit had been left behind on that distant riverbank where his dreams of limitless conquest had finally met an immovable obstacle. He spent long hours alone in his tent, studying maps of regions he would never see, reading accounts of lands that would forever remain beyond his reach. The voyage down the Indus revealed both the best and worst of Alexander's character during this difficult period. His tactical brilliance remained undiminished as he demonstrated in the campaign against the Mali, a fierce tribe that controlled strategic positions along the river. But his legendary caution in battle seemed to have deserted him, replaced by a recklessness that bordered on suicidal. The siege of the Malian citadel became a symbol of this new, darker Alexander. When his soldiers hesitated before the seemingly impregnable walls, the king grabbed a ladder and began climbing toward enemy ramparts alone. His bodyguards, terrified that their commander was about to throw his life away in a moment of madness, scrambled to follow him up the wall. What happened next was seared into the memory of every man who witnessed it. Alexander, reaching the top of the wall before his guards, found himself alone and surrounded by enemies. Instead of waiting for support, he leaped down into the citadel, landing in the midst of a crowd of hostile warriors, like a hero from one of Homer's epic poems. The Malian defenders, perhaps awed by such magnificent audacity, hesitated just long enough for Alexander to draw his sword and begin carving a space around himself. But there were too many enemies, and even the greatest warrior could not fight an entire city alone. A Malian archer, drawing his bow from close range, sent an arrow through Alexander's breastplate and deep into his lung. As the king fell, his bodyguards finally managed to break through the gates and fight their way to his side. The battle that followed was terrible in its fury, the desperate rage of soldiers who thought they were watching their beloved commander die. By the time the fighting ended, the citadel was a charnel house, its defenders dead to the last man. But Alexander lay motionless in a pool of his own blood. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance as the army's physicians struggled to save their king's life. The arrow had penetrated deep, perhaps fatally deep, and Alexander's breathing was labored and shallow. Rumors spread through the camp that the conqueror of the world was dying, that the great adventure was ending not in triumph, but in tragedy, on the banks of a river whose name few Greeks could pronounce. But Alexander, perhaps sustained by the same divine favor that had carried him through so many battles, fought his way back from the edge of death. When he finally opened his eyes and recognized the faces of his anxious officers, the relief that swept through the army was like a physical force. Soldiers who had faced death in a dozen battles wept openly, overwhelmed by the realization of how close they had come to losing the man who had given meaning to their lives. The recovery was slow and painful, complicated by infections that the army's physicians struggled to understand. For weeks, Alexander remained weak and feverish, his great strength sapped by the wound that had come so close to killing him. But gradually, the iron constitution that had carried him through 8 years of campaigning reasserted itself, and the king began to take an active role in planning the continuation of the march. The army that finally reached the mouth of the Indus was a shadow of the force that had crossed into Asia. Disease and battle had taken their toll, but more devastating was the gradual erosion of the spirit that had once made these soldiers believe they could conquer the world. They had seen their king wounded nearly unto death, had watched him transformed from the confident young general they had followed from Macedonia into something harder and more distant. The easy camaraderie of the early campaigns was gone, replaced by a formality that reminded everyone of the vast gulf that now separated Alexander from even his closest companions. The decision to split the army for the journey home reflected both practical necessity and the growing tensions within the command structure. Craterus, one of Alexander's most trusted generals, would lead the main body of troops along the established routes through the Iranian plateau, following roads that were well supplied and relatively safe. Nearchus would take the fleet along the coast, mapping the shores of the Arabian Sea and establishing bases for future operations. Alexander himself chose the most dangerous route, leading a picked force through the Gedrosian Desert, that vast wasteland that separated the Indus Valley from the Persian heartland. It was a journey that many considered suicidal, an attempt to cross one of the most inhospitable regions on earth, with an army already weakened by years of campaigning. But for Alexander, the desert represented something more than just a challenge to be overcome. It was a test of his own endurance, a final proving ground where he could demonstrate that the king who had once seemed invincible was still worthy of the legends that surrounded his name. The march through Gedrosia became one of the most harrowing episodes in military history. The desert was a realm of shifting sand and burning rock, where water was more precious than gold, and the sun was an enemy more deadly than any human foe. Day after day, the column struggled forward under a merciless sky, leaving behind a trail of equipment and supplies that the soldiers could no longer carry. Men began to die, not from enemy action, but from exhaustion and thirst, their bodies simply unable to endure the combination of heat, dehydration, and the relentless demands of the march. Alexander, sharing every hardship with his soldiers, refused the small comforts that his rank might have afforded. When water was scarce, he went thirsty with the rest. When the march became too difficult for the wounded and sick, he walked beside them, offering what encouragement he could. The story that would be remembered from the desert crossing was simple, but profound. When a patrol found a small amount of water and brought it to Alexander in a helmet, the king looked at the precious liquid, then slowly poured it out onto the sand in full view of his army. "If there is not enough for everyone," he said, "then there is not enough for me." It was a gesture that captured everything that had made Alexander great, the willingness to share hardship with his followers that had won him their devotion in the first place. But it also highlighted the terrible cost of the leadership style that had carried him to the ends of the earth. In seeking to be everything to his army, Alexander had burned through his own reserves of strength and compassion, leaving himself increasingly isolated, even as he continued to inspire those around him. When the survivors of the desert crossing finally reached the Persian Gulf, they were more ghosts than men, their faces burned black by the sun, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and loss. Nearly a quarter of the force that had entered the desert was gone, claimed by the wilderness that Alexander had insisted on crossing. But those who remained had been forged into something harder than steel, bound together by shared suffering and the knowledge that they had endured something that would be remembered as long as men told stories of courage and endurance. The reunion with Crusaders and the main army in Persia should have been a moment of celebration, the successful conclusion of the greatest military adventure in history. Instead, it revealed the depth of the problems that had been growing during Alexander's absence. The empire that he had built through conquest was beginning to tear itself apart through corruption, rebellion, and the simple impossibility of governing such vast territories with the primitive communications and transportation available to ancient rulers. Many of the satraps Alexander had appointed to govern his eastern provinces had assumed that his long absence meant he was dead, killed in some distant battle or claimed by the harsh climate of India. They had begun ruling their territories as independent kingdoms, ignoring orders from Babylon and establishing their own armies and treasuries. Some had grown so bold as to openly rebel against Macedonian authority, confident that no punishment could reach them across the thousands of miles that separated them from their nominal king. Alexander's response to these challenges was swift and terrible. One by one, the rebellious satraps were hunted down and executed, their armies scattered and their treasures confiscated. The loyalty that could not be commanded through love or respect was enforced through fear, as the returning king demonstrated that his long absence had not diminished his ability to strike down those who defied his will. But even as he reasserted his authority over the rebellious provinces, Alexander was grappling with a more fundamental problem: how to govern an empire that was simply too large and diverse for any single man to control effectively. The solution he had begun to implement before his departure for India, the integration of Persian and Macedonian administrative practices, had created as many problems as it solved. The mass wedding at Susa, where Alexander forced his senior officers to marry Persian noblewomen, was intended as a symbol of the cultural fusion that would bind his empire together. Instead, it became a source of bitter resentment among the Macedonian veterans who saw it as a betrayal of everything they had fought for. They had conquered the Persian Empire, they believed, not to become Persians themselves, but to impose Greek values and customs on the barbarous East. The introduction of Persian soldiers into the Macedonian army units provoked an even stronger reaction. When Alexander announced that he was incorporating 30,000 young Persians who had been trained in Macedonian tactics into his forces, the veterans who had followed him from the Granicus to the Hydaspes openly mutinied. At Opis, the confrontation between the king and his army reached a crisis that threatened to destroy everything Alexander had built. The mutiny at Opis was unlike anything Alexander had faced before. These were not enemies to be defeated in battle, but his own soldiers, men who had shared his dangers and his triumphs, demanding that he choose between his Macedonian heritage and his imperial ambitions. When they accused him of abandoning his father's people for the sake of barbarian flatterers, Alexander's famous temper finally exploded. "You think you can threaten me?" he shouted, his voice carrying across the assembled ranks like the crack of a whip. "You, who would be nothing without the victories I have won for you, who would still be herding goats in the mountains of Macedon if I had not led you to glory. Take your discharge papers and go home to your farms. Tell your children how you abandoned Alexander when he needed you most." The confrontation ended with reconciliation, as both sides stepped back from the brink of irreparable breach. But the incident revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Alexander's empire. It was too large to be governed as a Macedonian kingdom, but too dependent on Macedonian military power to be transformed into something genuinely cosmopolitan. As the army prepared for the final march to Babylon, where Alexander planned to establish his permanent capital, the king must have reflected on how much had changed since the day he had first crossed the Hellespont. The young man who had once believed that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle now understood that some problems could not be solved with a sword, that the skills that made a great conqueror were not necessarily the same as those required to build a lasting peace. The greatest test of Alexander's character was yet to come, however. In Ecbatana, the ancient capital of Media, tragedy struck the royal household with a force that shattered what remained of the young king's emotional equilibrium. Hephaestion, the friend who had been closer than a brother, the companion who had shared every triumph and every danger since their youth in Pella, fell ill with a fever that no physician could cure. For 7 days, Alexander maintained a vigil beside his friend's bedside, refusing food and sleep, using every resource of his empire in a desperate attempt to save the man who meant more to him than all his conquests combined. When Hephaestion finally died, Alexander's grief was so terrible that it seemed to consume everything around him. The king, who had faced down armies and conquered continents, was brought to his knees by the loss of the one person who had truly understood and shared his dreams. The funeral that Alexander arranged for Hephaestion was the most magnificent the ancient world had ever seen, a display of wealth and sorrow that consumed the treasury of a dozen provinces. But no amount of gold or ceremony could fill the void left by his friend's death. In losing Hephaestion, Alexander had lost not just his closest companion, but the last connection to the man he had been before power and glory had changed him beyond recognition. As the great funeral pyre burned in the hills above Ecbatana, sending smoke signals toward the distant stars, Alexander stood, watching with eyes that had seen too much and a heart that had been broken by the one loss that all his victories could not prevent. The boy from Macedon, who had once dreamed of conquering the world, had achieved everything he had ever wanted, only to discover that the greatest triumphs could not protect him from the most basic human sorrows. The march to Babylon would be the last campaign of Alexander's career, though none who watched the still young king organize his forces could have imagined that the greatest conqueror in history had only months left to live. But perhaps there were signs for those who knew how to read them. The increasingly erratic behavior, the growing dependence on wine and celebration, the wild plans for conquests that even his most devoted followers recognized as impossibly grandiose. The empire that Alexander had built through force of arms and strength of will was beginning to show the strains that would eventually tear it apart. But for now, it still held together through the sheer magnetism of the man who had created it, the king who had proven that the impossible was merely the untried, that the dreams of youth could reshape the very foundations of the world. Babylon in the spring of 323. BCE was the greatest city in the world, its ziggurat rising toward heaven like a stone mountain built by human hands, its markets filled with the treasures of 3 continents, its streets echoing with the voices of 12 different peoples. Here, in the city that had been old when Pella was just a cluster of mud huts, Alexander had chosen to establish the center of his world empire, the capital from which he would govern territories that stretched from the Adriatic Sea to the Indus River. The palace that the king had claimed for his residence was a marvel of Persian architecture, its halls cooled by ingenious systems of channels and fountains, its walls decorated with the artistic treasures that the Achaemenid kings had gathered from across their vast domains. But for all its splendor, the palace felt strangely empty to those who had known Alexander in his prime. The easy laughter and constant activity that had once characterized his court had been replaced by a more formal atmosphere, as if the building itself reflected the growing distance between the king and the men who served him. Alexander, at 32, was still young by any reasonable measure, but the years of constant campaigning had taken their toll in ways that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. His face, once smooth and boyish, now bore the lines of command and the scars of battles fought in 12 different lands. His eyes, which had once blazed with enthusiasm for each new adventure, now held a distant look, as if he were seeing something that existed beyond the reach of ordinary mortals. The plans that consumed Alexander during his final months revealed both the scope of his ambition and the fundamental changes that had taken place in his character since the death of Hephaestion. No longer content with governing the territories he had already conquered, he was planning new campaigns that would dwarf everything he had accomplished before. The conquest of Arabia, the circumnavigation of Africa, the exploration of the Western Ocean that was said to bound the world. All were projects that occupied his thoughts as he paced the halls of his palace like a caged lion. His generals and advisers listened to these schemes with growing concern, not because they doubted their king's ability to accomplish whatever he set his mind to. 8 years of impossible victories had taught them never to underestimate Alexander's capabilities, but because they recognized in his grandiose plans the symptoms of a man who had lost touch with the limits that constrained ordinary mortals. The preparations for the Arabian campaign revealed the extent to which Alexander had become isolated from the practical realities of governing his empire. While he dreamed of new conquests, the territories he had already won were showing dangerous signs of strain. The integration of Persian and Macedonian administrative systems was proceeding slowly and imperfectly, creating confusion and resentment on both sides. The huge distances involved in governing such a vast territory meant that orders from Babylon might take months to reach their destinations, and reports from distant provinces arrived long after the events they described had ceased to be relevant. More seriously, the financial costs of maintaining Alexander's empire were beginning to outstrip even its enormous resources. The treasure of Darius, vast as it had been, was not inexhaustible, and the expenses of keeping armies in the field across 3 continents were consuming gold faster than the imperial tax system could replenish it. The mass payments to discharge veterans and the magnificent public works projects that Alexander had undertaken to celebrate his victories had further strained the imperial treasury. But the king seemed oblivious to these mounting problems, his attention focused entirely on the horizons that still remained unconquered. In his private moments, he spoke of reaching the ocean that was supposed to surround the world, of sailing beyond the pillars of Heracles to discover what lay beyond the setting sun. It was as if the very success of his conquests had made the mundane business of governing seem beneath his notice, as if ruling the world was less interesting than conquering it had been. The last great celebration of Alexander's reign was the wedding of his officers to Persian noblewomen, a ceremony that was intended to symbolize the fusion of East and West that he believed would be his greatest legacy. For days, Babylon was given over to festivities that surpassed anything the ancient world had ever seen. Gold flowed like water, wine flowed like rivers, and the most skilled artists and entertainers from across the empire performed for audiences that included kings and satraps, generals and philosophers, merchants and diplomats from the farthest corners of the known world. But beneath the surface, magnificence, tensions that had been building for years, finally began to surface. The Macedonian veterans who had followed Alexander from their mountain homeland watched with bitter resentment as their king honored Persian customs and elevated Persian nobles to positions of authority. They had conquered the Persian Empire, they believed, not to become Persians themselves, but to impose Macedonian rule on the barbarous East. The Persian nobles, for their part, found themselves caught between loyalty to their new master and the expectations of their own people. Alexander's attempts to create a unified ruling class by marrying Persian women to Macedonian men and adopting Persian court ceremonies had satisfied neither side completely. Too many Persians still saw the Macedonians as foreign occupiers, while too many Macedonians regarded the Persians as defeated enemies who should be grateful for any consideration at all. It was during these celebrations that the first signs of Alexander's final illness appeared. At a banquet honoring Nearchus, the admiral who had successfully navigated the fleet from the Indus to the Persian Gulf, the king drank heavily and complained of fever and exhaustion. The symptoms were not immediately alarming. Alexander had always been a heavy drinker, and the climate of Mesopotamia was notoriously unhealthy for men accustomed to cooler regions. But the fever persisted, and within days it had become clear that this was no ordinary illness. Alexander, the man who had seemed almost supernaturally resistant to disease and injury, found himself confined to his bed, his great strength draining away like water poured onto sand. The court physicians, the finest medical practitioners available in the ancient world, applied every remedy known to their science, but nothing seemed to slow the progression of the mysterious ailment. As word of the king's illness spread through Babylon, the city began to take on the atmosphere of a funeral watch. In the palace, Alexander's officers maintained their vigils with the dedication of men who knew they were witnessing the end of an era. In the streets, common soldiers and civilians gathered in small groups, sharing rumors and fears about what would happen if the man who held their world together should die. Alexander himself seemed strangely calm as his condition worsened. Perhaps he had always known that his life would be brief but brilliant, a shooting star that would burn across the sky of history and then fade into legend. He had achieved more in 32 years than most men could accomplish in a dozen lifetimes, had built an empire larger than any that had come before, had carried the banner of Greek civilization to the very edges of the known world. The end came quietly, without the dramatic final speeches that later historians would invent. On June 10th, 323 BCE, Alexander simply stopped breathing, his great spirit departing as gently as a sigh. The king who had thundered across the ancient world like a force of nature died in silence, leaving behind only questions about what might have been and a legacy that would echo through the centuries. The immediate aftermath of Alexander's death revealed the fundamental weakness of an empire that had been held together by the personal magnetism of a single man. Without their king to provide direction and authority, Alexander's generals began to eye each other with suspicion and calculation. The unity that had carried them from Macedonia to India dissolved almost immediately into competing factions, each claiming to represent the true spirit of Alexander's legacy. The question of succession proved impossible to resolve peacefully. Alexander had no obvious heir. His son by Roxane was still an infant, and his half-brother Philip Aridaeus was mentally incapable of ruling effectively. The generals who had shared his campaigns and his triumphs now found themselves competing for control of territories that no single man could hope to govern. What followed was inevitable but tragic, a series of wars that would consume the better part of a generation and scatter Alexander's empire like leaves before the wind. Ptolemy claimed Egypt and founded a dynasty that would endure for 3 centuries. Seleucus carved out a kingdom that stretched from Syria to the borders of India. Antigonus and his descendants would rule in Asia Minor and Macedonia, while other generals established smaller kingdoms in Thrace and Bactria. The wars of the Diadochi, as Alexander's successors came to be known, were fought with a bitterness that would have horrified their former commander. These men, who had once stood together against the armies of Darius, now turned their weapons against each other, each claiming to be the true heir to Alexander's vision, while systematically destroying everything he had built. The great cities that Alexander had founded became pawns in this deadly game, changing hands repeatedly as the various factions struggled for supremacy. Alexandria, the jewel of the Mediterranean, found itself under Ptolemaic rule and gradually developed into something its founder might not have recognized. Still magnificent, still wealthy, but Egyptian rather than truly cosmopolitan. The fusion of Greek and Persian cultures that Alexander had worked so hard to achieve proved to be one of the first casualties of the succession wars. In their desperate need for legitimacy and support, the Diadochi appealed to the ethnic loyalties that Alexander had tried to transcend. Greek cities were promised independence from barbarian rule, while Persian nobles were told that their traditional ways would be respected and preserved. Yet even as Alexander's political legacy crumbled in the decades following his death, his cultural impact continued to spread across the ancient world. The Greek language, which his armies had carried to the borders of India, became the common tongue of scholarship and commerce throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Greek art and architecture, Greek philosophy and science took root in lands where they had never existed before and flourished in forms that would have amazed their creators. In Egypt, the Ptolemies established the Museum and Library of Alexandria, institutions that would preserve and expand upon the intellectual achievements of the classical world for nearly 1,000 years. Scholars from across the known world came to study in the city that bore Alexander's name, creating a synthesis of Greek, Egyptian, and Eastern learning that would profoundly influence the development of human knowledge. In the Far East, the Greek kingdoms that survived the wars of succession became centers of cultural exchange between the Hellenic world and the civilizations of India and Central Asia. Buddhist art began to show Greek influences, while Greek philosophy was enriched by contact with Eastern religious and ethical systems. The coins minted by the Greek kings of Bactria and India bore inscriptions in both Greek and local languages, symbols of a cultural dialogue that Alexander's conquests had made possible. But perhaps the most lasting aspect of Alexander's legacy was not political or cultural, but mythological. Almost from the moment of his death, the historical Alexander began to be transformed into something larger than life, a figure who belonged as much to legend as to history. The stories told about him grew in the telling, acquiring magical and supernatural elements that reflected the impact his brief career had made on the human imagination. In the medieval period, the Alexander romance became one of the most popular literary works in the world, translated into dozens of languages and adapted to reflect the values and concerns of many different cultures. To Christian writers, Alexander became a precursor of Christ, a pagan king who had prepared the world for the coming of the gospel. To Islamic scholars, he was Iskander, a wise ruler and seeker after truth who had learned the secrets of life and death. Even in lands that Alexander had never seen, his name became synonymous with the very idea of conquest and empire. Medieval European kings claimed descent from him. Chinese emperors compared their achievements to his, and African rulers invoked his example to justify their own expansionist policies. The boy from Macedon had become a universal symbol, a figure who represented the eternal human dream of transcending all limitations and achieving the impossible. But what would Alexander himself have thought of this transformation? The man who had raged against the turning back at the Hyphasis, who had dreamed of conquering lands beyond the ocean that bounded the world, might have been satisfied to know that his legend would prove more durable than his empire. The physical territories he had conquered were lost within a generation of his death. But the idea of Alexander, the vision of what one extraordinary individual could accomplish through courage, determination, and genius, would endure for millennia. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the palace of Babylon was silent, except for the gentle sound of fountains playing in the darkness, those who had known Alexander best might have reflected on the strange trajectory of his life. He had begun as a provincial prince in a kingdom that most Greeks regarded as barely civilized, had transformed himself into the master of the known world, and had ended as something approaching a god in the eyes of his subjects. The price of such transformation had been enormous. The boy who had played in the gardens of Pella, who had listened with wide eyes to his mother's stories of heroes and gods, had grown into a man who could no longer find peace in simple human relationships. The king who had once shared his soldiers' hardships and dangers had become increasingly isolated by the very greatness that set him apart from ordinary mortals. Perhaps that was the ultimate tragedy of Alexander's story, that in achieving everything he had ever dreamed of, he had lost the capacity to enjoy what he had won. The empire that was supposed to be his greatest triumph had become a burden that consumed all his energy and attention. The fame that was supposed to make him immortal had cut him off from the normal human connections that might have given his life meaning beyond mere conquest. Yet there was something magnificent even in this tragedy, something that elevated Alexander's story above the ordinary rise and fall of kings and kingdoms. He had dared to dream on a scale that defied rational calculation, had pursued a vision that was quite literally world-changing, and had come closer than anyone before or since to actually achieving it. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows of the palace where Alexander had died, the servants who prepared his body for burial must have marveled at how young he still looked. The face that had been known from Spain to India was barely marked by the years that had contained such an enormous accumulation of experience. In death, the conqueror of the world looked like what he had always been at heart, a young man who had grown up too fast and burned too brightly to last for long. The funeral that followed was worthy of the man it honored, a procession that took 2 years to carry Alexander's body from Babylon to its final resting place in Alexandria. The golden sarcophagus, drawn by 64 mules and accompanied by an honor guard of the finest soldiers from across the former empire, became a symbol of the grandeur that had characterized everything Alexander touched. But the true monument to Alexander's memory wasn't built of gold and precious stones. It was the world he had transformed through his conquests, the civilization he had spread from its Mediterranean birthplace to the farthest reaches of the known world. Long after his empire had crumbled and his successors had been forgotten, the cultural synthesis he had initiated would continue to shape human development. The Greek cities he had founded would preserve classical learning through the dark ages that followed the fall of Rome. The trade routes he had established would carry not just goods, but ideas across vast distances, creating connections between civilizations that had never been in contact before. The example he had set would inspire countless imitators, some noble and some base, but all testifying to the enduring power of his vision. In the end, perhaps that was Alexander's greatest victory. Not the conquest of territories that could be lost, or the accumulation of wealth that could be spent, but the expansion of human possibilities, the demonstration that the barriers that seemed to limit mortal achievement were often nothing more than failures of imagination and will. The boy from Macedon who had dreamed of rivaling Achilles had surpassed all the heroes of legend. The young king who had set out to avenge the Persian invasions of Greece had created a new world in which the very concepts of Greek and barbarian, East and West, had been transformed beyond recognition. The man who had died at 32 had accomplished more than most civilizations achieved in centuries. As the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, indifferent to the rise and fall of human ambitions, they looked down on a world that had been forever changed by the passage of one extraordinary life. Alexander was gone, but the world he had created would endure, a testament to the power of dreams to reshape reality when they are pursued with sufficient courage and determination. The legend of Alexander the Great would outlive all the kingdoms that claimed to be his heirs, would inspire poets and philosophers, conquerors and kings, rebels and dreamers across the centuries. In the end, the boy who had once hurled his spear into Asian soil and claimed a continent as his prize had achieved something even greater than empire. He had become immortal, not in the flesh, but in the eternal human memory of what one individual could accomplish when blessed with genius, cursed with ambition, and given the opportunity to test both against the vast possibilities of an unfinished world. And so, the story ends where it began, in the realm of dreams and legends, where the impossible becomes inevitable, and the briefest lives can cast the longest shadows. Alexander the Great had lived and died, but Alexander the inspiration, Alexander the symbol, Alexander the eternal reminder that the only real limits are those we accept for ourselves, would live forever in the hearts of all who dare to dream of greatness. There is nothing impossible to him who will try. Alexander the Great.